What's up, Change the Channel podcast listeners? My name is Megan Grace, and today on Change the Channel, I have a special guest for you. I am so excited to introduce and invite Alyssa Rose of Alyssa Rose Healing to the podcast. Let's get ready for another episode of Change the Channel podcast. Let's see how this sounds.
How does this sound?
Does it feel a little bit better?
This feels better.
I kind of like being close with you when we talk anyway.
We can eye gaze.
I know, right? The people will feel the connection. They will. Welcome back to the show. I am so excited to be having this conversation with Alyssa today. I wish you could actually be in our room with us. We're huddled around one mic, making the cutest faces at each other, talking about this because today we're going to be talking about and changing the channel around topics of grief and belonging and kind of the feeling of ritual, and also with a dash of play, because why not? So Alyssa and I, we found each other in sort of a conventional and unconventional way. But yeah, we'll just talk a little bit more about that. Alyssa, I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be talking about this with you.
So Alyssa and I first met in massage school, and as we both sort of laugh and say, we were both kind of on mission and didn't speak a whole lot. Just trying to, get through the program and all of that. But Alyssa is just such a natural healer, musician, very tapped into people, and a beautiful listener. And so I ended up actually connecting with her after my uncle had suddenly died. And I knew that Alyssa did, well, actually, no, I posted something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you posted maybe on Facebook or posted somewhere, and I reached out after hearing that there was a death close to you and just offered if I could hold you in that space and offer somatic grief work or body work in some way. And so you came in and we reconnected after massage school around that.
Yeah. It was so special. And so in that moment, when I was in a space of kind of disembodied grief feeling, Alyssa has this ability to sit in levity around things that are challenging and hard for a lot of people, like death. And so as we were sort of talking and moving through things, I was feeling so much better. And then there was this kind of key element of something that had come into our conversation.
Yeah, for me, throughout the session, Megan you mentioned some of your spirit guides. Mm-hmm. And then we spoke a little bit about that because I had not yet engaged with spirit or with guide animals, really. And you had brought animals in and your animal guides into the conversation and invited me to explore that. And I immediately jumped into that after you left, and was able to really connect deeply with animal guides of my own, specifically the horse and the snake. And that has been such a powerful thread through my life since that session we had. Years ago,
so many years ago.
5 pre-COVID.
Exactly. So Alyssa, part of her work is multidimensional, multifaceted, but this kind of meeting story is kind of a beautiful meet cute of a lot of the work that she does. Alyssa is a new mom of one of the cutest baby girls you will ever see in your life. She also is a life transition doula. She helps people in all stages of grief, changing times and seasons and places, and is also an incredible massage therapist. So just really excited to have you here. And I would love to know, in topics of belonging, especially in this new life transition that you're in as a mama, I would love to know what has surprised you the most, or what are you finding in your own channels that are changing around belonging right now?
Thank you. Belonging is something I'm thinking about so much right now, and I've wondered often when I leave grief ritual spaces why all of these strangers and all of these people all express a deep, deep sense of belonging afterwards. So I've been thinking a lot about belonging and what are some of the ingredients without trying to dissect a ritual and take away the magic of what happens in that space, but really just staying open and curious about the mystery and creating a sense of belonging in the modern day. What does that look like? For me, becoming a new mom has been a really beautiful experience of that. One surprise has been in letting myself ask for help and receive support.
Ooh, yeah, that's juicy. How's that feel for you?
Really, that's been really beautiful, and it's been really connective. One awesome part of that is when you actually ask for help and receive it, you're able to see someone's personality come to life more. I've been amazed at watching friends say, show up and be like, hey, can I night doula for you? I'll come at this hour and do X, Y, or Z things, and things that I would never think of. Or, hey, I'm going to come and bring this dish because I love this dish for my family. So I'm going to bring this over. And it's been a really beautiful way to get to actually know the people who are offering help.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's so much conversation in the space around healing work where, there's like a quote person that's helping and a person that needs help. And it sounds like you're actually changing some of the associations around that then.
Yes, actually, I'm so glad you bring that up because there can be such a big idea that I have to finish my own healing before I can offer support or healing to anyone else, which is false.
And spoiler alert, we are not promoting that.
Yes. And I remember feeling so humbled by sitting with a woman that I love and work with very closely, Luna, and going to her for help and support and seeing that she was in the midst of grief and she was crying when I arrived to her, that she was grieving and crying as I was going to ask for support from her. And it's an exchange. It happens in both ways. And that we really witness in grief ritual, where someone goes to the grieving altar because grief is moving through them, and someone else comes to emotionally tend to them and be fully present with them. And then as that process completes, everyone returns to the village, and then the roles often change very dramatically. Often the person that was holding space then is overcome with grief, and then now they're at the grieving altar being held by someone else.
Interesting. That's really okay. What is that? Can you explain a little bit of the embodied experience of being in ritual with other people? And have you been in a space where you've held space for people and then turned around and had kind of the overcome feeling of grief?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? What does that feel like?
Yeah, that feels like what we're meant to do and doing, instead of this idea that there's fixed teachers or fixed guides. Parents are the authority, fixed authorities, really. So instead of this more fluid exchange, so in grief ritual, that happens for me all the time. And I love co-facilitating grief ritual because then I can really help create the container and then lean into and use the container myself. There have been grief rituals that I helped set up, and then I am at the altar 3 or 4 times. And then also holding space. And it can be so beautiful when the roles really do just change as literally as that same person that I was holding space for is now holding space for me. But it can be much wider and less direct than that too.
Well, I can imagine too, these are beautiful examples. I can imagine you being a new mom and having someone come and show their sparkle and their magic by what they want to bring to you and to, your kiddo and the dynamic. Then it's almost like when you would be in the presence of them wanting to potentially give back to them, them on a deeper level because they've been vulnerable with themselves of what they're giving, what they're sharing in that connection, but also probably in grief ritual too. Like if somebody is emoting and you're seeing so much of them and witnessing their open sense, then when they come to hold space for you, I can imagine it allows so much more opening, right?
Definitely. Yeah. It's been really beautiful. And we I experience sometimes a lot of hesitance of like, is this going to offend someone? Or is bringing my baby to grief ritual going to be hard for other people? But what happens is so beautiful. I went with Adiona to grief ritual when she was 7 weeks old. And so it's like 30 adults, 1 dog, and 1 baby.
That sounds like the beginning of a band.
Yeah, it was so lovely. And many of the people that were at that ritual were in ritual with me when I was 7 weeks pregnant with her. And so that was really beautiful to now be in that space together. And my own concerns about like the baby's going to make all the baby sounds, and of course makes all the baby sounds during the meditations and the quiet times, and just sleeps through the grieving, sleeps through the wailing. But having her presence is like, these things are not inconveniences. They bring up things in the room that it's an invitation for other things to come up. So I ended up in small groups, working with people who were really confronted by the fact that I was there nursing a baby with their own wounds and grief around fertility and the choice to have kids or the choice not to have kids. And so getting away from this idea that like what I come with is going to be an inconvenience or bothersome, and be like, this is actually perfect, trusting the intelligence of the circle or the gathering, whether it's 2 people getting together for coffee or whatever the thing is. Just bringing it and allowing the unfolding to happen.
Wow. That's such a beautiful point too. The thought of what I bring might be a problem, but actually what you bring might be the catalyst to bring up what someone didn't even know that they needed space to work through. And wouldn't it be nice if this stuff could happen at, I don't know, a grief ritual space that's set up for things like grieving?
Yes.
Because you are a life transition doula, which means you probably do care for a lot of people that have to do with all types of grief.
Yes.
When it comes to, or all stages of life too, whether it's being pregnant or all the various outcomes of pregnancy.
Yes.
And all the various feelings around having babies and, and babies' connection to families and wow, what a juicy play. And then to have your own baby be sort of the invitation for others to feel that too. That's special.
It's been really beautiful. Yeah, and the life changes doula work. Like I started off as an end-of-life doula and grief tending, really focused on loss, which can be so associated to death. But there's so many versions of loss and so many kinds of loss that we experience throughout our whole lives. I used to get a lot of clients that would come to me because they lost someone, like my mother died. And so they're coming to a grief counselor or a grief guide to work on that. But then when we actually start talking, there are so many other versions of grief that wouldn't be associated with grief, but are really, really present and activated. And so then it gives us the opportunity to go deeper into many other areas.
What, if you can just think off the top of your head, what are a couple of the more subtle grief things that that tend to surprise either you or your clients that you're working with?
Yeah, well, I lean on the 5 Gates of Grief a lot by Frances Weller. And so those gates are, and I won't have this in the same order, but it's everything that I love, I will lose, which for me, I found that through Buddhism. In high school, I found a Buddhist monastery 20 minutes away and would drive out there. And so I started to engage in that idea of impermanence. So the first gate is everything we love, we will lose, or it will change form. The second one is the parts of me that have not known love. So that's huge, especially now with IFS, internal family systems. We're engaging with that a lot more. There's also the sorrows of the world, which is also huge. How do we be aware and be global citizens, but also be full of hope and creative action and engaged in our world without becoming so hopeless when we're engaged in the world collective? One that is the biggest is what I expected and did not receive, as something that felt surprising to be associated with grief and surprises people. Like, oh, I need to make space for my grief around that. And the last one is ancestral grief, which is also a big one. So for me, some of the big surprises are around what I expected and did not receive. That's a huge one.
Did you feel that when she said that? Can you say that one more time? Because that hit in a, I don't know, a visceral way for me.
Yeah, that gate, what I expected and did not receive. Because so often our expectations are silent or invisible, or we're not aware of what we're expecting. And then the disappointment and the letdown, even coming here and not having village. Showing up here and wanting village and not having village. Or if I follow a certain life path or certain morals set out for me, I'm going to get X, Y, or Z kind of life. Or there's so many versions of it, big and small, that need space for our grief.
Yeah. No, that's really beautiful. And then it circles back around to the idea of belonging. And I know one of the things that you talked about with me that I've kind of loved this concept is about making almost like more grief literature and making grief be more of an integrated part of everyday experience, not like we have 4 days a year that we will talk about whatever this is because we're living, breathing people having these experiences. And I know you talked about kind of this component, this idea of almost inviting kind of almost like an ambassador, like a person to know some of this grief literature, because you can unpack a lot of it because you speak on it much more eloquently than me. But what I loved about it was the idea that belonging sometimes can be fostered because somebody knows, they know the words and they know the way maybe a little bit. Like they're not as startled by the outside stimuli and they have, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, a granola bar in their, in their back pocket, or like a first aid kit when something shows up. It's like, I have some tools and some things to support you. And you've been so passionate about this. I'd love to just open up the floor to anything you want to talk about with that. And like your vision, if we could just call it in, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to get to the vision, but I want to touch on what you were just describing about like having the granola bar. That's exactly how I think about grief work. First of all, we don't do the grief work. The grief works on us, right? It works through us and on us. And there's a desire there's a desire to organize grief into a easier way or into a cleaner way. I have a lot of people setting up intentions or speaking about their intentions of doing grief work so that they can do grief better or better handle the wild ride of emotions that loss gifts us. And it's just meant to be messy. It's like not meant for us to control, right? So it is messy. It's designed to be messy. Making space for grief is really, really important. And back to the granola bar thing, I've always thought about it as like, I am going to walk with you on the path, on your specific path. Like I have a map, I'm carrying your bags, I have a compass, but it's your trail and you are guiding us. Like, and I just have some of the resources to help support. So this kind of this like hiking, this nature walk, but it's really about me supporting you and your relationship with grief and with loss throughout your whole life. So when it comes to grief work, I think about that a lot. Like I'm not going to fix it none of us are going to fix it for each other. It's really meant to break our hearts. I actually think grief is going to save our world because if we let ourselves feel how sad we are about climate change, how devastating it is to lose some of the places that we most love or to lose certain relationships, lose these things. If we let ourselves feel that, I believe that is going to be the catalyst to change. But we have to soften and associate ourselves back to the body. Okay, those are a few of my rabbit trails.
That. Oh my gosh, what a trail worth traveling. I mean, it's beautiful imagery.
Thanks.
And then I've always loved this idea that you talk about. It's almost like for people to belong, a lot of times an obstacle to belonging can be not understanding the language or the expectations or the culture or why is there a baby in this room? Like all of that, is that allowed? Like all of that stuff that almost seems to be an obstacle for belonging. And can you tell us a little bit more about your vision of like empowering people to know what to do or not even know what to do, but have those tools to be sort of little lighthouses in their community.
Yeah. I feel really committed to grief literacy and expanding our culture's capacity to hold, be with, move grief. And so for me, I am not an expert in grief. I don't believe there's experts in grief, but I knew that I needed other people in my grief with me, which is why I started creating spaces for grief. So during COVID, I was hosting a monthly death salon and then have been hosting monthly grief rituals in Portland ever since things opened back up. And I just knew that I needed space and I needed other people. And so I'm really interested in empowering people to go make spaces and practices in their communities for grief, because I do believe that grief ritual is a practice of belonging. And by practicing this and coming together and making spaces for grief and like a scaffolding for kind of how we can be together in grief, we both bring down our fear around our own personal grief, but we also bring down the fear of our capacity to be with each other in their discomfort. So a lot of people are like, something traumatic just happened to someone I love and I don't know what to do or say, and I'm afraid I'm going to make it worse. So the more we come together around these topics, the more we build competency, which means we bring down our fear and bring up our capacity. And so then we're able to lean in, and people can feel belonging when they're in the depths of these wounds around a disconnection. Like a lot of grief is about a break in belonging. And so when we can create a space of belonging, we're able to surface different things. Different things can come up and be looked at, held, and healed. And I also think then from a place of belonging, and anchoring, right? We can take creative risks from a place of connection. Then we can think creatively about the challenges of our world and come up with creative possibilities and also beauty to help solve a lot of what our world really desperately needs our attention on.
I love that. So it's almost the adding a heartbeat back into problems that shut things down.
Yes.
Or shut people down.
Yeah. Because I think the grief and the sorrow and the heartbreak that we feel is a key element of those things, needs to be in the room in order to feel the impact. I've been listening to a lot of Andrea Gibson and also Ayla Nario, an artist who I love, and there's just an essence. I wonder about this. There's an essence of like, do I talk about the hard things? Do I talk about how terrible factory farming is? Or do I talk about how beautiful and cool this animal is? And like Ayla Nario, she sings to the trees and about the trees because her heart is breaking about climate change. But instead of talking about the destruction, she's talking about the beauty. And there's space for both. But I think we need the broken heart in the room to also inspire us to create.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. It's almost, I know, at least in my bodywork practice, people tend to, the reason they think to come see me is because something hurts. And then once they come into the session, it's like, oh, that was literally just that was the invitation to what the rest of all of your body was asking for. That was just the part that was speaking. I like to call it your body ally, the part that you are trained or understand how to connect to the most. So when it talks, you know how to listen.
I love that.
You know how to show up for it. I also am loving kind of the duality of the, like, maybe some of us, for example, I tend to lead much more into levity. Like, I made a freaking podcast about being the hype woman in your pocket, like that is.
Yes.
Like I'm going to sing to the trees and tell the sky it's beautiful, and sparkle. And then, but for me, a lot of my work is to actually get some resiliency around sitting with brokenhearted moments and things, because if I hop out of it too quickly, then it's almost like jumping off the surgeon's table in the middle of surgery. And then you're like, I don't know why everything's falling out. And you're like, because nothing has been stitched up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. People jump so much to fixing or to acting. And the place for the pause to really, really feel how we're impacted is, to me, really important and something that's often missed.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I just am so struck on the idea of like, do you show the destruction or do you show the beauty? Like, do you add the sorrow and the joy? And it almost feels like what you're saying is yes and. Bring it all.
Yes. And I'm really, really interested in how do we, like, I'm creating grief rituals because I feel that we need to remember and re-envision how we handle grief in our world. But the goal is not to just have grief rituals. Like, I want the vision that I see is having gatherings and having a culture and a community of people who can handle the extremes of both. I last summer was at a gathering and we were singing and recording a number of songs about grief, but they were very specifically like, this is not a grief ritual. And in the nights, we would have song circles. And again, not grief ritual, song circles. So we would all get together and we're singing, and the joy and celebration would get so high. It would peak it was outside, but it would peak in the community, in the space, that it would hit the same kind of depth of grief. It would transition. It was like a light switch. So we would get to this deep level of celebration and joy for life, and then it would just turn into grieving and wailing, and it would touch like the space that is disconnected and traumatized too. Because sometimes when you do feel this depth of belonging that you have been longing for, it also awakens the loneliness that you have felt without it.
That is so powerful. That's so true. And I wonder if that's why people either struggle or try to reach the heights or try to reach the opposite extremes of things. Because it's almost like that itch you can't scratch. You're like, well, I need to get to this point of grief, but it's too painful to go this way. I'm going to just laugh really hard. And then laughing turns to wailing.
Absolutely.
Or moving your body. Like, there's nothing more confusing than being like, I'm just in a dance class. And the next thing you know, you're like, I want to cry because we've been doing so much shoulder stuff. Like, who the hell knew that this was living in my shoulders?
Absolutely.
I love that. Okay. I'm also curious. So, can you paint a picture for me of what is ritual? I love that you use these words so often, or, like, I'm going to sit with you, or I'm going to do these things. And I oftentimes, I love you, so I'm like, whatever we want to do is great. But can you paint that picture for other people so that maybe some of them are already doing this and they don't even know it, or they might be intrigued about it, want to know how to be that as a support for their community. And so I can put information about your work in the show notes so then people can find you about it.
Great. Yeah. Ritual has many different forms and definitions, but for me, I think of ritual, I turn to ritual when I'm seeking guidance or support in some way, and I'm asking for that from beyond the human realm, right? So for me, coming into a ritual space is setting up a space to ask and to open to a wider presence. So grief ritual in my practice and the way I work with people, I often work with people one-to-one to create grief ritual in their own lives. This can be super casual or it can be very elaborate, but it could be as casual as making an ancestral altar or a space of remembrance with photos or objects of that which we're carrying, that which is heavy on the heart, or even a specific loss. Say you lost someone specific, you could make an altar towards that person, and you could just go there for 5 minutes a day, or you could go there and light a candle, or you could go there, light a candle, and sit with your eyes closed, or you could listen to music that they loved. There's something about making the space, going to that space, and being still or connecting with that person or that spirit or that whatever it is. But it's about connection, and it's about opening and listening. So that's those are some of the small ways into a personal grief ritual. Bigger grief rituals can be much longer. They can be, I mean, I've been doing day long and weekends, but they could be longer than that. So there's a lot more context setting in a group and connecting in a group, and then invoking any spirits that we're working with or guides that we're working with, and kind of coming into a humble space of like, we're asking for help. We're asking for you to help us carry this. It's too much. And listening and trusting. And for me, when I'm thinking about ritual and how to make it really accessible for people, I'm trying to get really out of the way. So I'm trying to just create a scaffolding of like an opening and a closing. I want there to be beauty and inspiration. That feels really important. So often bringing in poetry and often bringing in embodiment, because there's so much that needs to be expressed and moved not through the English language. And so, drumming and movement, or even just toning with our voices, or all of these things can also help us feel and move grief.
I love that. That's beautiful. So it almost feels like it's there's elements of it that are personal, but what I love about it too is it's the idea of, creating a space for people to go back to have moments of remembrance. Remember hearing that grief is often like where love doesn't have a place to go, or yes, something like that. I'm butchering it, but
you're doing great.
like that concept. And so I wonder if the idea of belonging, as we're, bringing it all kind of back around, belonging can be the invitation of the memory of a person with the opportunity to have a special place so that you can stay present where you are, and then adding the elements that feel the most special or resonant or that kind of thing, but not too much or not too little, but just whatever feels good for that person.
Yes. And I agree. Loss and death, these things can sever a connection, but they don't end the relationship. So if you're grieving someone who has died, you cannot call them on the phone the same way or talk to them and spend time with them the same way. But creating an altar and a ritual is how you figure out a new way for that exchange to happen, for you to love them. It's now, I might not be able to pick up the phone and call, but I go and I listen to the music that they loved when they were alive, or I eat their favorite food and enjoy that because they enjoyed that so much when they were here. So it is about like, how do I love and receive love now that the form has changed? Many of my clients talk about, upon a big death that they're grieving, a wider awareness of the natural world, of like, oh, this blue dragonfly came and I know that was him. And, so it can also open you up to receive love and care from your person or whatever the loss is that we weren't aware of before.
That's so interesting too, because even when we were talking at the beginning, you were learning to receive care, in these new ways as a mom. And it's almost like, as we move through these transitions of time within the beauty and dynamicness of relationships, it's this idea that the medium or the texture of the relationship or the connection might change, but belonging is the desire to keep that alive.
Yes.
In some new way, like the dragonfly or like a casserole or like,
absolutely,
perfume or like all of that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to circle back also, as you were, to the point for me in grief work is not to get better at doing grief. But my goal is to make it so we trust that when we are grieving, we know where to go. And we can trust that we'll be held, because a lot of people come and they're like, I was grieving and I was dropped in these certain ways because the people around them didn't know how to take care of them. So I really want us to focus not on like getting better at grieving, because that's not really the point. But to build communities or build spaces, kind of like those lighthouse people, right? Where when you are experiencing a big loss, you know that you will be held, you know how to ask, or that you can ask, and that you will be held and witnessed. And that to me, the piece of belonging that we can create.
Ooh, that's so beautiful. And I don't know about you, but I feel like each person comes from a family, and a lot of times our family or the culture that we're in shapes what we believe we're allowed to do in those spaces. And it almost feels like you're wanting to create a bit more of a kind of universal language, or a universal belonging piece where people can bring whatever their background is, and it's less about that, and it's more about how it feels to not be dropped when something hurts.
Yes.
And to empower people to know, like, we're not trying to fix anything, because I don't know about you, but my body responds so poorly to people trying to fix me. Even if I want them to, I'm like, it's like, no, thank you. You don't understand me. So
yes. Well, and I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, and I'm glad you do, is like, one of my big questions is, how do we, as a group of people from all different backgrounds, different spirituality, different relationship with religion, and all these different kinds of beliefs, how do we show up into a space and create a meaningful ritual when we aren't coming from shared values? So that is a really interesting question that I pose to all the groups I'm working with. I don't have the answers on that, but it's kind of why I'm interested in creating a spacious scaffolding so that you, all of you listeners who are tapped into your specific communities, can feel empowered with this outline, kind of this, what a ritual could look like. You can bring that loosely, but with the knowledge that you have by being a part of your community in to create something there.
I love that. I love that. Belonging is such a deep topic. I don't know if I'd ever thought about belonging so much through the lens of grief before, which is really cool to get to sit with that, because like in my family, grieving or sad, hard things always happened by yourself and behind closed doors. And that, I mean, it makes sense, but it also has with it its benefits and its challenges. So it makes a lot of sense to me that you're wanting to make sure that nobody is left out.
Yeah, and that we can grow more comfortable with our own discomfort. Like, I had to get really comfortable with my own hopelessness and despair and disappointment and all of those things.
Casually.
Yeah. Or else, like, when a client comes to me, I am going to do all the things we don't want to happen. I'm going to try to fix it. I'm going to try to distract or cheerlead because I'm uncomfortable with it. So we have to get used to and familiar with those within ourselves. And then we won't be afraid of each other's emotions and discomfort. And so we can trust, I can even trust myself that I don't have to fix it or know anything about what someone's going through, but I know how to be present with them. I'm really, really constantly reminded of what I was told in hospice volunteering, which was, you are the medicine. Your presence is the medicine. It's not about you doing or fixing anything. It's about how fully can you be with someone, that period. So that's so hard because we're so used to trying to do things or to change it or to fix it. And so how can I be hands off but fully here and let myself be impacted? That's something I talk about in ritual too, is like there's a desire to be neutral. And in therapeutic worlds, we talk about the therapist being neutral. But in these spaces that are more around belonging and relationship and community, I'm not promoting neutrality, as much as allowing ourselves to be impacted. But if you are the witnesser of someone else's trauma and grief, your response needs to be quieter than theirs, just so that they don't start taking care of you. Or it needs to go outward. Like, we talk also about concentric circles and the energy going outward from the person experiencing the biggest loss outward to their closest people, and then outward to their people, and not going back inward towards the people who are closest to the big event or the big loss.
Wow. That's beautiful. That's so important too. And that it even weaves a deeper net of belonging then. If the concept is to be the person that's bringing grief, and actually, okay, so the image that I'm getting is like, there's a person that's grieving that's opened up to like a person maybe that matters to them, which is the next ring out. and then that person connects then with someone else. It's a next ring out. Like, it almost feels like grief then is like a pebble on a still pond that allows the ripples of people to be known and intertwined and connected. And instead of it being like, oh no, somebody poisoned the water hole with this or whatever, it's like, no, you are the pebble that starts the ripple of connection and of people leaning in and having those deep listeners, and inviting each other into our experience of witnessing other people's experiences. That's so cool.
It's so cool. And it's such a deep piece of the connecting and the belonging, because it really highlights our shared humanity, and it really works on fear. Often you're in the room with someone who has gone through a thing that you fear deeply, or maybe even your biggest fear, and they're explaining that has happened to them, or they've gone through that. And so by doing this in community, it works on fear, and it builds a sense of resilience of like, whoa, people are strong. And I can also hear other people talk about my exact experience, but through someone else's version of it and their language and their experience of it. So sometimes you hear people speak to exactly what you're going through, or what you're going through, but from the opposite side, and things like that. So it's like such a glue. Yeah. And it's such a shared well of wisdom. That's the thing with grief. There's no experts, but there's a shared well of wisdom that when we do offer our experiences and allow ourselves to be seen, that we can grow in our resourcing and our strength to be able to handle really big things in our lives, really hard things in our lives and in our communities.
I love that too. Kind of our last little bit. I could literally talk to you for forever. I'm sure everyone here would love to listen to you for forever. But what I'm kind of sensing too is it's this feeling of like the griever is almost a gift as well. And moving away from this idea that we need to have studied enough, know enough, like, am I like credentialed enough to help? It's more like the credentialing isn't the living, and the living isn't staying embodied in things. And as we're embodied and listening to other people and processing actively what's happening within ourselves, we start to build the resiliency.
Yes.
And that's the study, right?
Yes. And grieving people have often been really respected and seen as doing work on behalf of the village. And so if we can bring that in as well, adopt that and trust the grieving process, that's going to be really huge. And I just have to say, like, a lot of my influence and inspiration and education is from Soban Fusome, who brought Grief Ritual here to the U.S. I'm also very inspired by the work of Frances Weller and Stephen Jenkinson, but Soban Fusome is where all of my work around ritual really comes from and is informed by.
I love that. That's so great.
To our teachers.
To our teachers that are our friends, to our teachers that are our friends' kids, to our teachers that are our friends' elders, to all. Yes. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
What a gift. And just an invitation to all the listeners, maybe this week in big and small ways, imagine maybe what was a thing that an expectation that you had that wasn't met, that might be a beautiful space to start writing about, to open up some of those resiliency patterns around grieving. And then also, I'll put Alyssa's information again in the show notes, mine as well. And if you are grieving and you want to feel a sense of belonging, can reach out and be with people that are ready to be with you. How's that sound?
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for listening. This is another episode of Change the Channel podcast.